Book 8, 51 to 50 BC. This book was written by Aulus Hirtius, one of Caesar's officers. In his preface he explains why and how he came to complete Caesar's own account of the wars in Gaul. His prefatory letter is addressed to Lucius Cornelius Balbus, one of Caesar's friends and, perhaps, his most important political agent. Dear Balbus, you have constantly asked me to do what I am doing now, and I have as constantly refused. It must have looked as though I was backing out of the job through laziness, rather than declining it because it is too hard for me. However, you now have your own way. I have taken on this most difficult assignment, and have written a supplement to our great Caesar's own account of the Gallic wars, as otherwise there is no continuity between this work and his later writings. I have also completed his later work, which he carried as far as the operations in Alexandria, and then left unfinished. I have continued the story, not until the end of civil war, no end is in sight, but up to the death of Caesar. I hope that my readers will realize how very reluctantly I have taken on this job of writing. If so, I shall perhaps avoid being considered both stupid and arrogant for having intruded myself into the middle of Caesar's works. For it is generally agreed that in Caesar's commentaries there is a kind of natural elegance which surpasses the most polished and elaborate writings of others. They were published so that future historians of those great years should have the knowledge from which to write. But they have been so admired by all good judges that it looks rather as though Caesar has not so much given these future historians their opportunity to distinguish themselves as taken away from them all possibility of doing so. You and I, however, must admire these works even more than others do. Others can appreciate the skill and precision of Caesar's writing. We know how easily and how quickly he worked. He not only wrote with the most consummate ease and in the most masterly way, but had an absolutely sure touch when it came to explaining his plans and ideas. Unfortunately, I was not engaged myself in either the Alexandrian or the African campaigns. True, I know something about them through having listened to Caesar himself talking on the subject. But then I was listening in wonder and admiration to an account of events which was strange to me. It is different when one listens to events which one is going to use later in an objective history. But I can see that in putting together all these reasons why I should not be compared with Caesar, I am incurring the very charge of presumption which I want to avoid. For how can I imagine that anyone would compare me with Caesar anyway? Farewell. Suppression of the Bituriges, Carnutes, and Bellovaci. The whole of Gaul was now subdued, and since the troops had been engaged in continual war ever since the previous summer, Caesar wanted them to have a rest in their winter quarters after all that they had been through. However, it was reported that several states at once were still planning war and plotting another revolt. The reason given for this movement was probably the correct one. The Gauls, it was said, had now realized that however many troops they might concentrate in one place, they would still not be able to stand up to us. But on the other hand, they thought that if a number of states all started wars in different parts of the country at the same time, the Roman army would not be in a position to employ sufficient strength or sufficient manpower to deal with all of them at once. Therefore, so the Gauls concluded, every state should be prepared to make any sacrifice that might be necessary, knowing that so long as it held up the enemy, it would be helping the rest to win back their liberty. Caesar did not want this idea of the Gauls to take root. He left the quaestor, Mark Antony, in command of the winter camp, and on the last day of December set out for Bebructe himself, with a cavalry escort, to join the 13th Legion, which was stationed in the country of the Bituriges, not far from the Aeduan frontier. Caesar brought the neighbouring 11th Legion, together with the 13th, left 2 cohorts from each to guard the baggage, and then led the rest of the force into the most fertile part of the country of the Bituriges. This tribe covered a wide area, and had a number of strongholds. A single legion in winter quarters had not been enough to stop them from preparing for war and conspiring with their neighbours. Caesar's sudden appearance among them, while they were still unprepared and dispersed, brought the inevitable consequence. They were cultivating their lands without any suspicion of danger, and they were cut off by our cavalry before they could escape to their strongholds. They did not even get the usual warning of an invasion, the sight of smoke rising up from burning buildings. Caesar had forbidden anything to be set on fire so as to avoid alarming the enemy, and to make sure that there would be plenty of grain and fodder available if he wanted to march farther. After many thousands of their people had been taken prisoner, the Bituriges became panic-stricken. Those who had managed to escape at the beginning of our invasion had fled to the neighbouring tribes, relying on personal friends to help them, or else trusting to the general anti-Roman feeling which all shared. But it was no good. By means of forced marches, Caesar was liable to appear anywhere. He made the tribes think about how to save themselves, allowing them no time to think about what they could do for other people. By this speed of action he retained the loyalty of those who were his friends and intimidated the waverers, so that they were ready to sue for peace. The Bituriges saw that Caesar was merciful, that it was still possible for them to regain his friendship, and that the tribes on their frontiers had delivered hostages and been taken back again under his protection without suffering any punishment. With such a prospect before them, they also made their submission. In these winter days there had been exceptionally difficult marches and almost unendurable cold, yet the troops had stuck to the job magnificently. In reward for their hard work and their patience, Caesar promised each soldier a gratuity of 200 sesterces, and each centurion 2,000 sesterces in lieu of booty. He then sent the legions back to their winter camps and returned to Bebructe himself 40 days after he had set out. While he was there and occupied with his judicial business, a deputation arrived from the Bituriges to complain that they were being attacked by the Carnutes, and to ask him for help. After receiving this news, although he had been only 18 days at Bebructe, he summoned the 14th and 6th Legions from their quarters on the Seine, where, as explained in Book 7 of the Commentaries, they had been posted to secure the grain supply. He then set out with these 2 legions on a punitive expedition against the Carnutes. When the enemy heard that our army was on its way, they remembered what had happened to the other rebels. They abandoned their villages and towns, where they were living in wretched buildings hurriedly erected to provide shelter for the winter, for in their recent defeat they had had to relinquish a number of their regular strongholds, and fled in all directions. The weather at this time of the year is at its very worst, and Caesar did not wish to expose his troops to it, so he camped inside Kirabum, the capital of Carnutes. The soldiers were billeted either in houses belonging to the Gauls or in sheds built onto them, and hurriedly roofed with the thatch used for tent covers. But the cavalry and auxiliary infantry were sent out in every direction which the enemy was reported to have taken. With success, too, for our men nearly always came back loaded with booty. The Carnutes suffered badly from the rigours of the winter. They were terrified for their lives. They had been driven from their homes and did not dare to stop long in any one spot, nor in this bitter weather could they find safety or shelter in the forests. A large part of the population perished, and the rest scattered abroad among the tribes on their frontiers. It was the worst time of the year for military operations. Caesar believed that to prevent war breaking out, it was sufficient to disperse any native troops that attempted to concentrate, and he felt reasonably sure that no war on a really large scale could be initiated until the summer campaigning season. He therefore stationed the 2 legions he had brought with him in a winter camp at Cenabum, and left Gaius Trebonius in command. He was constantly receiving deputations from the Remi, who reported that the Bellovaci and neighbouring tribes were mobilizing and bringing their forces together under the leadership of Corius of the Bellovaci and Comius the Atrebatian. The Bellovaci had a reputation in war which was more glorious than that of any other tribe in Gaul or Belgium. The plan now was, so it was said, for them and their allies to make a concerted attack on the Suessiones, a tribe who were dependents of the Remi. Caesar knew that the Remi had a splendid record of loyalty to Rome, and he believed that to save them from disaster was something which concerned not only his own honour, but also the general interest. So he again called on the 11th Legion to leave its winter camp. He also wrote to Gaius Fabius, telling him to bring his 2 legions into the country of the Suessiones, and sent for one of the 2 legions which Labienus commanded. In this way, so far as it was possible with regard to the situation of the various winter camps and the general strategy of the war, Caesar took the legions out in turn and gave each its own share of work, while he himself worked all the time. When the troops had been concentrated, he set out against the Bellovaci, camped inside their territory, and sent out squadrons of cavalry in all directions, with orders to bring in prisoners from whom he could find out what the enemy's plans were. The cavalry did as they were ordered, and reported back that only a very few people had been found in the houses, and that these had not stayed behind to cultivate the land, for there had been a most thorough evacuation of the whole country, but had been sent back to act as spies. Caesar inquired from these prisoners where the Bellovaci's main force was, and what were their intentions. The information he received was that all the Bellovaci who could bear arms, and also the Ambiani, Aulerci, Coleti, Veliocases, and Atrebates, had collected together in one place. For their camp they had chosen a position on high ground in a wood, which was surrounded by a marsh. All their property had been carried into the more remote forests. A number of chiefs, they said, were taking an active part in the revolt, but the one whom the people were most glad to follow was Corius, and this was because they knew he hated Rome with a quite peculiar violence. Caesar was also informed that a few days previously Comius the Atrebatian had left camp to get help from the Germans, who were not far away, and whose manpower was unlimited. The chiefs of the Bellovaci had unanimously agreed on the following plan, which was enthusiastically supported also by the rank and file. If Caesar came with 3 legions, they would offer battle rather than be compelled later to fight the whole Roman army under worse conditions, and with less favourable odds. But if he brought more than 3 legions with him, they would stand fast in the position they had chosen, and by laying ambushes would try to prevent the Romans from getting grain, forage, which at the time of the year could only be found in small quantities and in a few places, and other supplies. More prisoners were questioned, and all told the same story. In Caesar's view, the enemy's plan of campaign was a most sensible one, and showed no traces of the recklessness which usually characterizes these native tribes. He decided that every effort must be made to bring the enemy to battle as soon as possible, by making them think that the troops he had with him were few enough to be treated with contempt. In fact, his force consisted of 3 veteran legions of absolutely outstanding quality, the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and also the 11th Legion, which was composed of younger men of the best possible type. This legion was now on its 8th campaign, and Caesar regarded it as an extremely promising body of men, even though it had not yet won the same reputation for length of service and valour as the rest. Caesar summoned a council of war, passed on to the officers all the information he had received, and saw to it that the rank and file also were in good spirits. In the hope of being able to entice the enemy to give battle by making them believe that he had only 3 legions with him, he arranged the order of march as follows. The 7th, 8th, and 9th legions were to march in front. Then was to come the baggage train, which, even when placed all together, was quite small, as is usual on these quick expeditionary campaigns. Finally, the 11th legion was to bring up the rear. It would thus look to the enemy as though the force were no greater than the one which they had said they were prepared to engage. Marching in this way, in what amounted, in fact, to a formation in battle column, Caesar brought his army into sight of the enemy before they expected it. The plans of the Gauls, as they had been reported to Caesar, had seemed full of confidence, but now, when they suddenly saw the legions advancing with a firm step, and formed up as though for battle, they drew up their own forces in front of their camp, but did not leave the high ground. This may have been because they feared the risk of an engagement, or because we had arrived so suddenly, or merely because they wanted to see what we would do next. Caesar had been anxious to fight, but all the same he was surprised when he saw how many the enemy were. He now built a camp facing the enemy position with a deep, though not very wide, valley between him and them. He ordered the construction of a 12-foot rampart with a proportionately high breastwork. 2 trenches were to be dug, 15 feet wide, with perpendicular sides. Turrets of 3 stories were set at frequent intervals, and connected together by floored galleries, protected on the front by wicker breastworks. The idea was that the camp should be guarded not only by a double ditch, but also by a double line of defenders. One line, posted in the galleries, would be high enough to feel comparatively safe, and thus could both hurl their missiles with greater confidence and make them carry farther, while the second line, posted actually on the rampart and thus nearer to the enemy, would be protected by the galleries above them from missiles shot with a high trajectory. The gateways were fitted with doors and flanked with towers that were higher than the rest. In building these fortifications, Caesar had 2 objects in view. He hoped that the very size of the works would make the natives think that he was frightened, and would thus make them more confident. And he saw, too, that if he had to go rather far afield to get fodder and grain, the elaborate fortifications themselves, with only a small garrison, would be sufficient for the protection of the camp. There were frequent skirmishes between small detachments, which ran forward into the marshy ground between the 2 camps. Sometimes the marsh was actually crossed by our Gallic and German auxiliaries, following hard on the heels of the enemy, or at other times the Gauls in their turn would come over and force our men back. It happened, too, that in the course of our daily foraging expeditions, some of our foragers got isolated and surrounded in awkward positions. This was inevitable, as the hay had to be fetched from farms which were very few and far between. Our losses in this way of baggage animals and slaves were quite inconsiderable, but were enough to put foolish ideas into the heads of the natives. All the more so since Commius, who, as I mentioned before, had gone to get reinforcements from the Germans, and now returned with some cavalry. There were only about 500 of them, but the mere fact that the Germans had come at all was enough to fill the natives with confidence. Several days passed, and Caesar saw that the enemy were still staying in camp. He realized that it was so well defended by its naturally strong position, and by the marshes around it, that it could not be taken by assault unless one were to risk very great casualties, and to invest it with siege works would require a larger number of troops. He therefore wrote to Trebonius, instructing him to summon as quickly as he could the 13th Legion, which was in winter quarters among the Bituriges under Titus Sextius. This would give him 3 legions, and he was to set out with them by forced marches to join Caesar. Meanwhile, Caesar had secured the services of large cavalry forces from the Remi, the Lingones, and other states. He He used these tribal contingents in turns to escort the foraging parties and guard them against sudden attacks. This was done day after day, and as usually happens when the same action is constantly repeated, a feeling of routine led to a lack of vigilance. The Bellovaci got to know where our cavalry patrols were stationed each day, and laid an ambush of picked infantrymen in a wooded place. Next day they sent along some cavalry, who were first of all to entice our cavalry into the ambush, and then join in the attack when they were surrounded. It happened to be the Remi who suffered on this occasion, since it was their day on duty. They suddenly caught sight of the enemy cavalry, and, with a contempt based on their own superiority of numbers, pursued them too eagerly until they found themselves surrounded on every side by the infantry. They were so alarmed at this that they retreated much more quickly than is usual in a cavalry action, with the loss of their commander, Vertiscus, who was also the chief magistrate of their tribe. Vertiscus was almost too old to ride a horse at all, but with true Gallic spirit he would not make age an excuse for refusing the command, and wanted to be present personally whenever there was any fighting. The enemy were wildly pleased and excited over this success of theirs, which had involved the death of the chief magistrate and general of the Remi, and our own cavalry learned from this unfortunate experience to reconnoitre more carefully before posting patrols, and to show more sense when in pursuit of a retiring enemy. Meanwhile, fighting went on every day in sight of both camps at the places where there were fords or tracks across the marsh. In one of these engagements, the whole of the German infantry, which Caesar had brought from across the Rhine to fight among the cavalry, went resolutely across the marsh together, cut down the very few men who stood up to them, and then pressed on vigorously in pursuit of the rest. At this the Gauls fell into a panic, not only those who were engaged in actual hand-to-hand fighting, or exposed to weapons at long range, but even the reserves, who were as usual posted some distance off. The whole lot fled in the most disgraceful way. Even when they got onto higher ground they failed to make a stand, and in fact never stopped running till they reached their camp, at which point some of them, who were no doubt thoroughly ashamed of themselves, ran on still farther. The narrow escape of these men had an extraordinarily disturbing effect on the whole Gallic army. Indeed, one finds with these Gauls that just as they become unduly arrogant when they have some slight success, so will they be unreasonably timid after a very minor reverse. For several days the Bellovaci stayed in their camp, but when their leaders heard that Trebonius with the other legions was close at hand, they became afraid of being invested as Vercingetorix was at Alesia, and they sent away by night all who were too old or too weak to fight, and all who did not have arms. The rest of their baggage was to be sent off at the same time. It was a frightened and confused mass of people, with all the wagons, which normally accompany Gauls on the march, even when they are supposed to be travelling light. And daylight came while they were still trying to get their column into order. They therefore drew up their army in a line in front of their camp, so as to prevent the Romans from pursuing their baggage train until it was well on its way. So long as they stood on the defensive, Caesar was determined not to attack them, as this would mean advancing up a steep hill. However, they wanted to move the legions far enough forward to threaten the enemy, and make it impossible for them to leave their position without fear of being attacked. The marsh between the two camps was difficult to cross, and would slow down any pursuit, but beyond it was a ridge which stretched almost as far as the enemy's camp, and was only separated from it by one narrow valley. Caesar, therefore, had causeways laid over the marsh, led the legions across, and quickly reached the level ground on top of the ridge, which was protected on two sides by steep slopes. Here he reformed the legions, advanced to the edge of the high ground, and halted in line of battle at a distance from which the dense masses of the Gauls were in range of his artillery. The natives felt quite confident in the natural strength of their position, and were prepared to stand and fight if by any chance we were to attempt to attack them uphill. On the other hand, they could not withdraw their forces gradually and in small detachments, since they feared a state of general confusion if their army once lost its cohesion. They therefore stayed where they were in line of battle. When Caesar saw that they were not going to move, he measured the ground for a camp, and then had the fortifications built under a covering guard of 20 cohorts, ready for action. After the work was finished, he drew up the legions in battle order, below the rampart, and placed patrols of cavalry, with their horses bridled, at appropriate points. The Bellovaci saw that, if they moved, the Romans were ready to come after them. They could not stay safely where they were much longer, let alone spend the night there, so they made the following plan for getting away. They had in their camp great quantities of sticks and bundles of straw. These they passed along from hand to hand and put down in front of their line. At the end of the day the word was given, and the whole lot was set on fire at once. In a moment there was a continuous line of flame which hid their entire army from the Romans. Behind this barrier the natives took to flight and ran as hard as they could. Because of the flames, Caesar could not be sure that the enemy were in fact withdrawing, but he suspected that they had adopted the plan with the idea of making their escape. So he moved the legions farther forward, and sent out some squadrons of cavalry to follow up the enemy. He himself advanced with caution, since he feared the possibility of an ambush. The enemy might have the intention of standing firm once they had enticed us onto unfavourable ground. The cavalry, too, feared a trap. Most of them did not dare to penetrate the line of dense smoke with the fire still burning, and those who did press daringly into it found that they could hardly see as far as their own horses' heads. So the Bellovaci were able to get away without any interference from us. This withdrawal had been the result of fear, but it had been carried out with great cleverness. They suffered no losses at all, and after retiring about 10 miles, pitched camp in a very strong position. With this place as their base, they kept on sending out parties of infantry and cavalry, and placing them in ambushes from which they did a good deal of harm to our foragers. These attacks of theirs were becoming more and more frequent. In the end, however, Caesar found out from one of the prisoners that Curius, the commander of the Bellovaci, had set aside from his whole army a picked force of 6,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, intending to place them in an ambush at a place where he felt sure that the Romans would be sending forces of their own, because of the supplies of grain and forage that were there. On the strength of this report, Caesar brought out of camp more legions than usual. He sent the cavalry in front in the normal way as an escort for the foragers, and sent out some light-armed auxiliaries to fight in the ranks of the cavalry. He led the legions himself, and came with them as near the place as possible. The enemy were already in ambush. The place they had chosen for this business was a plain, not more than a square mile in area, and enclosed either by dense woods or by a very deep river. Their men, hidden in ambush, formed a cordon all round. We knew what their plan was. Our men had their arms ready for action, and were fully prepared for the struggle. With the legions coming up behind in support, they were ready to face anything, and so they rode, squadron by squadron, into the plain. Curius, as they appeared, believed that the moment had come for him to set about them. He came out into the open, at first with only a small force, and charged the nearest squadrons. Our men stood up well to this attack, and did not make the mistake of all crowding together, as troops very often do in cavalry engagements after some alarm, with the result that the more of them there are, the more casualties are inflicted on them. Our squadrons, therefore, took up positions at some distance from each other, and small detachments took turns in joining the action so as to prevent their comrades from being outflanked. But now, While Choreus was still fighting, the rest of the enemy cavalry charged out from the woods. Fierce fighting broke out in all parts of the field. For some time the struggle was evenly balanced. Then, little by little, the enemy's infantry force came out of hiding, formed up in battle order, and forced our cavalry to give way. But we were quickly supported by our own light infantry, which, as already mentioned, had been sent on ahead of the legions. These infantrymen, fighting in the ranks of the cavalry, put up a stout resistance. For some time the battle went on with no advantage to either side. In the end, however, the result was what might have been theoretically anticipated. We had held the first attack from the ambush, and the very fact that at that moment we had kept our heads and suffered no losses now began to put us on top. Meanwhile, the legions were drawing nearer. Messengers kept on arriving, and both sides heard at the same time that the commander-in-chief, with his troops in battle order, was close at hand. At this news, our men, now sure of the support of the cohorts, fought all the more fiercely, not wanting the business to drag on so that they would have to share the glory of victory with the legions. But the enemy's morale collapsed, and they began to try, one way or another, to escape. It was no good. They now found themselves in the very trap which they had designed for the Romans. Still, broken and defeated, and panic-stricken by the loss of more than half their forces, they fled on, some trying to escape by way of the woods, and some by the river. And as they fled they were cut down by our troops, who followed eagerly after them. But Choreus kept a spirit unbroken by any disaster. He refused to stop fighting and seek shelter in the woods. He refused to surrender when offered quarter. He fought on with the greatest gallantry, wounding his assailants on every side, until in the end our victorious troops, in sheer anger, stood round him and shot him down with their spears. So the battle went, and Caesar appeared on the scene just after the fighting was over. He imagined that when the Gauls received the news of this great defeat, they would abandon the position where they had their camp, which was said to be about 8 miles from the battlefield. There was a river in his way, but he nevertheless brought the troops across and went forward. Meanwhile, some of the fugitives, wounded and few in number, who, thanks to the woods, had managed to escape the general fate, suddenly appeared at the camp where the rest of the Bellovaci and the other tribes were, and gave the news of the disaster. The Bellovaci and their allies, realizing that everything was against them, that Choreus was killed, that their cavalry and the flower of their infantry had been wiped out, and thinking that the Romans would soon be upon them, hurriedly sounded the trumpet and summoned a general assembly, at which it was insistently demanded that a deputation with hostages should be sent to Caesar. This plan was approved by all, but Commius the Atrebatian fled to the Germans, from whom he had borrowed help for the campaign. The others immediately dispatched a deputation to Caesar, begging him to be satisfied with the punishment they had already suffered. It was a punishment, they said, much heavier than he, in his mercy and kindness, would ever have inflicted on them when their forces were still unimpaired, and if he had not had to fight a battle. As it was, they pointed out, the whole strength of their tribe had been broken in the cavalry battle. Many thousands of their best infantry had been destroyed, and only a handful had escaped to tell the story of the slaughter. Nevertheless, they said, great as the disaster had been, the Bellovaci had got one solid advantage out of the battle. Choreus, the demagogue who had started the war, had been killed. For so long as he was alive, it had been the ignorant masses and not the tribal council who exercised real authority. In reply to this petition, Caesar made the following points. Last year the Bellovaci, together with the other tribes of Gaul, had made war on Rome. The Bellovaci had stuck to their warlike intentions with more pertinacity than any of the rest, and, when the others had surrendered, still refused to return to their right minds. He knew perfectly well that the easiest thing in the world was to blame the dead for everything that had been done wrong, but in fact no one man, with only the feeble backing of the common people, could be strong enough to start and to carry on a war against the will of the tribal chiefs, in opposition to the tribal council, and against the feelings of all patriotic citizens. Nevertheless, he would be satisfied with the punishment they had brought upon themselves. That night, the representatives of the Bellovaci reported Caesar's answer to their people, and got together the hostages. Deputations now came hurrying in from all the other states which had been waiting to see how things went with the Bellovaci. These all delivered hostages, and did as they were told to do. The only exception was Commius, who was afraid to trust his life to anyone. This was because in the previous year, when Caesar was away holding the assizes in northern Italy, Labienus had discovered that Commius was busy in intrigues with the various states, and was forming a conspiracy against Caesar, and decided that to suppress such a traitor could not constitute an act of treachery on his part. He did not imagine that Commius would appear at his headquarters if summoned to do so, and he did not want to put him still more on his guard by trying to get him to come. So he sent Gaius Volusinus Quadratus with orders to pretend that he wanted an interview, and in the course of the interview to have Commius killed. Labienus gave Volusinus a number of specially chosen centurions to take with him. At the interview, Volusinus gave the agreed signal by seizing hold of Commius's hand, but either because he was unused to this sort of thing, or because Commius's friends quickly intervened, the centurion who was charged with killing the man failed to do so, though he gave him a severe wound in the head with the first blow of his sword. Swords were drawn by both parties, but both sides were more concerned with getting away than with fighting. Our men, because they thought that Commius was mortally wounded; the Gauls, because they saw that they had been led into a trap, and imagined that we had more men available than those whom they could see. After this, so it was said, Commius had decided that he would never again come into the presence of any Roman. Final operations. Capture of Buxolodonum. All the most warlike tribes had now been thoroughly subdued, and Caesar could see that there was no state left that was capable of organizing war or leading resistance. He noticed, however, that quite a number of people were moving out of the towns and leaving their lands so as to avoid having to live under Roman rule. He therefore decided to distribute his army over a wide area of the country. He kept with him the quaestor, Mark Antony, and the 12th Legion, and he sent Fabius with 25 cohorts to an entirely different part of Gaul, since he had heard that some of the tribes there were up in arms, and doubted whether the 2 legions with Gaius Caninius Rebilus, the general in charge of the area, were strong enough to deal with the situation. He summoned Titus Labienus to join him, but sent the 15th Legion, which had been with Labienus for the winter, into northern Italy to protect the colonies of Roman citizens there from the sort of barbarian invasion which had taken place in the previous summer, when the people of Trieste had been suddenly surprised and overwhelmed by raiding parties of brigands. Caesar himself set out to plunder and lay waste the country of Ambiorix. This king was terrified and on the run, and Caesar had given up hope of being able to get him into his power. The next best thing, and the thing which his honor demanded, was, he thought, to strip his country of inhabitants, buildings, and cattle so thoroughly as to make Ambiorix an object of hatred to any of his subjects who might happen to survive, so that he would never be able to come back to a state which because of him had suffered so greatly. So Caesar sent detachments of legionaries, or auxiliaries, all over Ambiorix's territory, killing, burning, and plundering. There was total devastation, and great numbers of the inhabitants were either killed or captured. After this, Caesar sent Labienus with 2 legions into the country of the Treveri. Because they are so close to Germany and constantly engaged in warfare, these Treveri were not at all unlike the Germans in their way of life and their ferocity. They never did what they were told unless there was an army on the spot to make them do it. Meanwhile, Caesar's general, Gaius Caninius, had received letters and messengers from Duratius, who had always remained loyal, though part of his tribe had revolted, telling him that a large enemy army had got together in the country of the Pictones. He therefore marched toward the town of Poitiers, and when he got near, received still more definite information from prisoners. He was told that Duratius was shut up in Poitiers, and being attacked there by Dumnacus, chief of the Andes, who had an army many thousands strong. Caninius would not risk battle with the enemy because his legions were below strength, so he built a camp in a strong position. As soon as he heard that Caninius was near, Dumnacus turned his whole army against the legions and tried to take the camp by storm. For several days he kept up the attack. Then, after having suffered heavy losses, and failed to break through our defences at any point, he went back again and resumed operations against Poitiers. Meanwhile, Gaius Fabius had been receiving the submission of various tribes and taking hostages from them as securities. While engaged in these activities, he received a dispatch from Caninius informing him of the situation in the country of the Pictones, and at once set out to the relief of Duratius. When Dumnacus heard that Fabius was on the way, he gave up hope. It would be an impossible position for him, he thought, if he had at one and the same time to watch out for a Roman attack from outside, and to be in fear of a counter-attack from the enemy inside the town. So he suddenly retired from Poitiers with all his forces, feeling that he would not be really safe unless he could get them across the river Loire, which was too wide to be crossed, except by one of the bridges. Fabius had not yet come in sight of the enemy, or joined up with Caninius, but from the information he received from people who knew the country, he came to the conclusion that the frightened Gauls would take precisely the route which in fact they were taking. So he pressed on with all his forces toward the same bridge as that for which Dumnacus was making. He ordered the cavalry to ride ahead of his column of legionaries, but not to go farther than the point from which they would be able to get back, without putting too much of a strain on the horses, to the place where he and the infantry were to camp. Our cavalry, following his instructions, came up with the column of Dumnacus's men, who were already retreating in panic, and were hampered by all the baggage they were carrying. Our men attacked them, killed a great many of them, and got away with a lot of booty. After this most successful action, they returned and joined the others in camp. On the following night, Fabius again sent his cavalry ahead with orders to engage the enemy and slow up the whole column until he should come up with it himself. His cavalry commander, Quintus Attius Varus, an officer of outstanding courage and intelligence, told his men exactly how Fabius's instructions were to be carried out, and went after the enemy column. He posted some of his squadrons in suitable positions to act as reserves, and with the rest joined battle with the enemy. The whole column halted, and the native cavalry fought back much more resolutely than before, having now the assistance of their infantry, who came up to support them against our attacks. There was some very fierce fighting. Our men despised an enemy whom they had beaten only yesterday. They remembered that the legions were coming up, and being both ashamed to give way and extremely anxious to finish the battle before the legionaries appeared, they fought against the Gallic infantry with the greatest courage. The enemy, on the other hand, judging by their experience of the previous day, imagined that no more reinforcements were coming up, and thought that they had an excellent opportunity to wipe out our cavalry. As the fighting went on for a long time, with neither side giving way, Dumnacus began to draw up his infantry in regular battle order, so that it would be in position to support every squadron of his cavalry as need arose. At this moment the legions, in close order, suddenly came into sight, and were seen by the enemy. Their cavalry were unnerved. Their infantry fell into a panic. Their baggage train was left in a state of utter confusion. Shouting and yelling, they scattered in all directions and took to flight. Our own cavalry, who a moment before had been struggling resolutely against a firm resistance, were now transported with the joy of victory. On every side they raised a great shout, swept all round the retreating enemy, and went on killing until their horses could go no farther, and their arms were too tired to strike another blow. In this battle more than 12,000 men were slaughtered, some still with arms in their hands, while others had thrown their arms away in the panic, and the entire baggage train was captured. After the rout it became known that Druppies, the Senonian, had got together from the fugitives a force of not more than 2,000, and that with these he was marching on the province. He was being assisted in this project by Lucterius, the Cadurcan. Ever since the beginning of Vercingetorix's rebellion, Druppies had been raiding our baggage trains and intercepting our supplies. He had collected bands of criminals from all quarters, slaves to whom he had promised their freedom, exiles whom he had summoned from every state, and brigands to whom he had given refuge. Lucterius, as we know from Book 7 of the Commentaries, had, at the beginning of the Gallic revolt, been in favour of invading the province. Caninius therefore hurried after them with 2 legions, wishing to prevent what would certainly be a great disgrace if the province were to suffer damage or be seriously disturbed by the wicked activities of these desperadoes. Gaius Fabius, with the rest of the army, set out against the Carnutes and the other states, whose forces, he knew, had been involved in the defeat which he had inflicted on Dumnacus. He was reasonably certain that after the disaster they had just suffered, these states would prove more easy to handle, but felt that, if too much time was given to them, Dumnacus might get to work and persuade them to fight again. As it happened, everything went right, and Fabius brought back these tribes remarkably quickly to their allegiance. The Carnutes, who, in spite of having often suffered from us, had never even proposed to come to terms, now gave hostages and surrendered. Their example had its effect on the rest, and the other states, the so-called Amorican tribes, who live in the extreme west of Gaul on the Atlantic, submitted immediately to Fabius's demands as soon as he and the legions appeared. Dumnacus was driven out of his own country. Alone, wandering and hiding in place after place, he was forced, in the end, to retire to the remotest parts of the country. We must now return to Druppies and Lucterius. When they heard that Caninius and his legions were close after them, they realized that, with an army on their heels, they would most certainly be destroyed if they invaded the province. And as they no longer had the chance of ranging over the country and living by brigandage, they halted in the country of the Cadurci. Lucterius had had great influence among his fellow tribesmen in these parts in the days before the defeat of Vercingetorix. He had been consistently in favour of revolutionary policies and still had a large following among these ignorant people. With his own forces and those of Druppies, he occupied the town of Buxolodon, a place of very great natural strength which had once been a dependency of his own, and got the townspeople to join him. Caninius quickly arrived before the town. He observed that it was protected on all sides by rocky precipices, which would be difficult enough for men in armour to climb, even if there was no one to defend them. On the other hand, he saw that the Gauls had great quantities of heavy baggage and material inside the place, and that if they attempted to get it secretly out of the town, they would have to move so slowly that not only our cavalry, but our legions would be able to overtake them. So, dividing his cohorts into 3 detachments, he built 3 camps at points where the ground was very high. From these camps he began to construct, as fast as he could, with the men available, entrenchments, which were to run round the town. The townspeople, seeing what he was doing, became alarmed. They remembered Alasia, and feared that the same terrible fate might be theirs if they were blockaded. Lucterius, who had been at Alasia himself, particularly stressed the importance of making sure of their grain supply, and the 2 leaders, with the agreement of all the rest, decided to leave part of their army inside the town, while they themselves went out with a body of light troops to bring in grain from the neighbourhood. The plan was approved, and on the following night Droppies and Lucterius, leaving 2,000 soldiers behind as a garrison, led the rest out of the town. After a few days spent in the country of the Cadurci, they had got together a great quantity of grain, some from tribesmen who were ready and anxious to help them, and some from people who were unable to stop them from taking it. They also made a number of night attacks on our redoubts, so that Caninius decided not to go on, for the time being, with his plan of total investment. If the circuit was complete, he thought, he would either have to leave parts of it unguarded, or else have to hold some sectors with an insufficient number of troops. After collecting great quantities of grain, Droppies and Lucterius took up a position not more than 10 miles away from the town. From here they intended to bring the grain inside, a little at a time. The responsibility for this operation was shared between them. While Droppies, with part of the army, stayed to guard the camp, Lucterius escorted the convoys of pack animals toward the town. He posted patrols on the outskirts, and then, just before dawn, started to bring the grain in along narrow paths through the woods, making enough noise to be heard by the sentries on duty at our camp. Scouts were sent out and reported back what was going on. Caninius moved quickly. Taking the troops who were under arms in the nearest redoubt, he attacked the convoy just as it was growing light. The men carrying grain were terrified at finding themselves suddenly in danger, and fled back in a disorderly way toward their own troops. Our men, now confronted with armed soldiers, attacked all the more fiercely, taking no prisoners at all. Lucterius himself, with a very few men, managed to escape, but did not go back to camp. After this success, Caninius found out from some prisoners that part of the enemy army, under Droppies, was in camp about 12 miles away. This information was corroborated by interrogating a number of individuals, and Caninius thought that, with one of their leaders already routed, it ought to be easy to strike panic into the rest and overwhelm them. It seemed to him a great stroke of luck that no one had managed to get back to camp after the slaughter of Lucterius's men to tell Droppies of the disaster they had suffered. Although he could see no danger involved in this operation, he sent forward toward the enemy's camp all his cavalry, and also the German infantry, troops who are exceptionally fast on their feet. He distributed the men of one legion among his own 3 camps, and took the other legion with him, armed and ready for action. When he was near the enemy position, he was informed by the patrols whom he had sent ahead that the Gauls, as they usually do, had left the higher ground and camped on the bank of a river, and that the cavalry and the Germans had suddenly swooped down on them, taking them completely by surprise. As soon as he got this information, he brought up the legion in battle formation. The signal was given, and they very quickly occupied all the surrounding heights. Now the Germans and the cavalry could see the standards of the legions, and they fought more fiercely still. Almost at once, from every side, the cohorts charged down. Every Gaul there was either killed or captured, and much booty fell into our hands. Droppies himself was taken prisoner in the action. It had been a brilliant success, achieved practically without a single casualty. Caninius now resumed the blockade of the townspeople, having destroyed the enemy force outside, the presence of which had previously made him afraid to disperse his own forces and prevented him from building a continuous line of fortifications. Now he ordered siege works to be constructed along the whole circuit. Next day he was joined by Gaius Fabius and his army, and Fabius took over our sector of the works. Meanwhile, Caesar had left Mark Antony, the quaestor, with 15 cohorts in the country of the Bellovaci to prevent the Belgae from attempting to give any more trouble. He himself visited the other states, demanding additional hostages, and also, since he found everyone in a state of terror, trying to alleviate the general anxiety. On arriving among the Carnutes, where, as Caesar explains in Book 7 of the Commentaries, the revolt had originally broken out, he found that the people, conscious as they were of their guilt, were more than ordinarily alarmed. In order to free this state from fear as soon as possible, he demanded that Gutruatus, who had been the ringleader of the rebellion and one of the organizers of the massacre at Cynabum, should be handed over for punishment. This man was in hiding, and was too frightened to trust himself even to any of his own countrymen. But they all joined actively in the search, and before long he was brought into the Roman camp. The soldiers regarded him as having been responsible for all the dangers they had undergone, and all the losses they had sustained in the war. They crowded round in a dense mass, and it was because of them that Caesar, whose natural inclination was always toward mercy, was compelled to deal severely with him. He was first flogged to death, and then beheaded. While still among the Carnutes, Caesar received from Caninius several letters, one after the other, informing him of what had happened to Drapes and Lucterius, and of the resolute stand taken up by the inhabitants of Buxolodonum. In Caesar's view, although the numbers engaged in this revolt were insignificant, the obstinacy which they were showing called for the severest punishment. Otherwise, he was afraid that the Gauls as a whole might begin to think that their failure to stand up to Rome had been due not so much to lack of strength as to lack of perseverance, and that the other states might follow the example of Buxolodonum, and, making use of whatever strong positions they possessed, attempt to regain their liberty. He realized that all the Gauls knew that there was only one more summer to go before the end of his term of office, and that if they could hold out until that time, they would have nothing to fear afterward. So he left the general, Quintus Collinus, with 2 legions to follow at the normal pace, while he himself, with all the cavalry, hurried as fast as possible to join Caninius. Everyone was surprised when Caesar appeared in front of Buxolodonum. He found that the town was by now so encircled by siege works that the enemy had no chance of getting away. But he discovered from deserters that the townspeople were very well supplied with grain. He therefore tried to cut off their water supply. The hill on which the town stood, with its steep precipices, was almost entirely surrounded by a deep valley, along which flowed a river. It was impossible to divert this river because of the nature of the ground. It ran at the very bottom of the mountain, so that there was no chance at all of draining off the water in any direction by digging trenches. However, the way down to the river from the town was extremely steep and difficult, and if our men were there to stop them, the townspeople would be unable either to get down to the water, or make the steep ascent again without danger to life and limb. Caesar noted this fact, and posted archers and slingers in appropriate positions. He also brought up artillery, which could be brought to bear on certain points where the descent was easiest. In this way, he succeeded in cutting the defenders off from the water they drew from the river. After this, the besieged could get their water from only one place. This was a spot just under the town wall on that side where, for about 300 feet, there was a gap in the circuit made by the river. Here a spring gushed out of the ground and gave an ample supply of water. Everyone wanted to cut off the townspeople from this spring, but only Caesar saw how it could be done. Directly opposite the place, he began to push mantlets up the hill, and to build a ramp. This meant not only hard work, but continual fighting. The townspeople would run down from the higher ground, and, without running any risk themselves, would engage us at long range, inflicting a number of casualties on our men as they doggedly worked their way up. However, our soldiers were not to be stopped. They pushed the mantlets farther and farther, and overcame the difficulties of the ground by hard work and ingenuity. At the same time, from the shelter of the mantlets, they were driving out tunnels toward the head of the spring, and this work could be carried out perfectly safely without the enemy having any suspicion that it was being done at all. The ramp was built up to a height of 60 feet, and a tower of 10 stories was erected on top of it, not with the object of reaching the level of the walls, which were beyond the reach of any siege works, but so as to be able to command the spring. Artillery fire from the tower was now concentrated on the approaches to the spring. The townspeople could no longer get water without risking their lives, and soon not only cattle and pack animals, but the great mass of the enemy themselves began to feel the pangs of thirst. The besieged were greatly disturbed by this setback. Their next move was to fill barrels with tallow, pitch, and dry wood, set them on fire, and roll them down onto our siege works. At the same time, they engaged us in fierce fighting so that our men would be kept busy in warding off danger from themselves, and would thus be unable to put out the fire. A great flame rose up at once from the siege works, since everything rolled down the hill necessarily landed against the mantlets and the ramp, and each burning piece of material set fire to whatever part of the structure it happened to be up against. Our soldiers were engaged in a hazardous form of fighting, and had every disadvantage of position. Yet they bore up against all difficulties with a most magnificent spirit. The action was being fought on high ground, in full view of our army, and there was a lot of shouting from both sides. So every man, in order to display his courage before the eyes of so many witnesses, made himself as conspicuous as possible in confronting enemy weapons or burning material. When Caesar saw that large numbers of his troops were being wounded, he ordered the cohorts to begin climbing the hill on all sides, and to raise a shout as though they were actually scaling the walls. This maneuver seriously alarmed the townspeople. As they could only guess at what was going on in other parts of the town, they recalled their armed forces from the attack on our siege works, and posted them on guard around the walls. Now that the fighting was over, our men quickly put out the flames, or isolated the parts of the terrace that continued to burn. However, the besieged continued to resist obstinately, and did not give in, even when numbers of them had died of thirst. Finally, our tunnels reached the sources of the spring, which were then tapped and diverted. The spring, which had never failed before, suddenly became dry, and the townspeople now lost all hope of deliverance. They thought that the drying up of the spring was due not to human skill, but to supernatural agency. So, yielding to necessity, they surrendered. Caesar was aware that his clemency was known to everyone, and had no fear that if he did take severe measures, anyone would think that there was any cruelty in his character. He knew, too, that he would never be able to carry out his plans for Gaul if revolts of this sort were allowed to break out constantly all over the country. He therefore decided to make an example of the inhabitants of Buxolodon in order to deter the rest. All who had borne arms had their hands cut off, and were then let go, so that as many as possible could see the punishment that had fallen upon evildoers. Trapeze, who, as mentioned above, had been taken prisoner by Caninius, refused to eat, and so died within a few days. Either he was unable to support the degradation of being in chains, or else he was afraid of a worse punishment. At the same time, Lucterius, who, as already described, escaped in the fighting, came into the hands of Epasnactus, an Arvernian, who was enthusiastically pro-Roman. Lucterius was well aware that he had earned Caesar's hostility, and, since he knew that he could not safely stay anywhere for long, had been constantly on the move, and trusting himself now to one person, now to another. Epasnactus, with no hesitation at all, had him put in chains and brought to Caesar. Meanwhile, Labienus had been in the country of the Treveri, where he had won a victory in a cavalry engagement, killing large numbers both of the Treveri themselves and of the Germans, who were always ready to help anyone against Rome. He took prisoner a number of the chiefs of the Treveri, and also an Aeduan chief called Surus, a man of good family, a most distinguished soldier, and the only Aeduan still in arms against us. On receiving this news, Caesar could see that things were going well in every part of Gaul. As the result of his campaigns, extending over the last few years, he could regard the whole country as defeated and subdued. But he had never personally visited Aquitania, although he could be said to have partially conquered it in the campaign of Publius Crassus. So he now set out with 2 legions for that part of Gaul to spend the last part of the summer there. His work here was, as always, carried out quickly and with complete success. Every state in Aquitania sent representatives to him and delivered hostages. Once these affairs were settled, he set out for Narbonne with an escort of cavalry, leaving his generals to see to the quartering of the army for the winter. He stationed 4 legions in Belgium under the generals Mark Antony, Gaius Trebonius, and Publius Vatinius. 2 were sent into the country of the Aedui, whom he knew to be the most important tribe in Gaul. 2 were posted among the Turoni, on the frontiers of the Carnutes, to hold that part of the country which extended up to the Atlantic, and the remaining 2 were stationed among the Lemovices, not far from the Arverni. He thus saw to it that the army was present in every part of Gaul. Caesar himself stayed for a few days in the province, paying rapid visits to all the towns where assizes were held, settling political disputes and distributing rewards among those who deserved them. He had an excellent opportunity of finding out what the attitude of various people and communities had been at the time of the Gallic revolt, a revolt which he had been able to suppress because of the loyal aid which had come to him from the province. When this business was finished, he joined the legions in Belgium and spent the winter at Nemetocena. While there, he heard of how Commius, the Atrebatian, had been engaged in action with the Roman cavalry. When Antony had arrived at his winter quarters, the Atrebates were quiet. But Commius, ever since the occasion already mentioned when he was wounded, had kept himself always ready to join in any trouble that his fellow countrymen might start, so that, if they ever decided on war, they should not lack a leader who could inspire them. Now, when his state was in obedience to us, he went about with his own band of horsemen, supporting both them and himself by highway robbery. By ambushing the roads, he had succeeded in intercepting several convoys on their way to the Roman winter camps. Gaius Volusinus Quadratus had been attached to Antony as cavalry commander, and was with him in his winter quarters. Antony accordingly sent Volusinus out to deal with these bands of enemy horsemen. This was an assignment very much to the taste of Volusinus, who was not only a man of absolutely outstanding courage and energy, but also entertained a particular hatred for Commius. He organized patrols in various parts of the country, frequently attacked Commius's men, and won the engagements which he fought with him. Finally, in the course of a particularly fierce encounter, Volusinus, in his eagerness to capture Commius himself, followed after him rather too persistently, and with only a few men. Commius fled away as fast as he could, drew the Romans farther and farther on, and then, in his hatred of Volusinus, he called out to his own people to show their loyalty and not to allow the wound that he had received through Roman treachery to remain unavenged. He wheeled his horse round, and, leaving the rest behind him, recklessly charged straight at Volusinus. All his men followed his example, and our small party was forced to turn about with the Gauls in pursuit. Commius spurred his horse on until he came up level with Volusinus, and then, couching his lance, drove it with all his force through his enemy's thigh. Seeing their commander wounded, our men at once pulled in their horses, faced about, and drove the enemy back. They charged so violently that some of the Gauls were knocked off their horses and wounded, others were ridden down while trying to escape, and still others were taken prisoner. Owing to the swiftness of his horse, Commius succeeded in avoiding this fate. Volusinus was carried back to camp, so seriously wounded that his life appeared to be in danger. Either because he felt that his injury had been avenged, or because he had lost the majority of his followers, Commius sent to Antony, and gave hostages to guarantee that he would live where he was instructed to live, and would carry out all commands given to him. He only asked one thing, which was that a concession should be made to his fears, and that he should not be required to come into the presence of any Roman. Antony regarded his fears as perfectly justified, granted his request, and accepted the hostages. Conclusion. I know that Caesar himself wrote one book of commentaries for each year of his campaigns, but I have not thought it necessary for me to do this, because in the following year, when Lucius Paulus and Gaius Marcellus were consuls, no large-scale operations took place in Gaul. But in order that people may know where Caesar himself was, and where his army was during this period, I have decided to write a few more words to form an appendix to this commentary. During the winter which he spent in Belgium, Caesar had just one aim in view, which was to keep the tribes loyal and see to it that none of them should have any reason for making war, or should imagine that they could gain anything from doing so. The last thing he wanted was to be compelled to fight a campaign just before he was going to leave the country, for he saw that if he left behind him any kind of armed resistance, when the time came to withdraw the army, the whole of Gaul, with no deterrent on the spot, would be only too ready to join in such a movement. So he expressed himself with the greatest courtesy, and addressing the tribal governments, gave valuable gifts to the chieftains, and imposed no further burdens on the country, which was thoroughly exhausted as the result of so many defeats. In this way, by making the terms of subjection more tolerable, he had no difficulty in preserving peace in Gaul. As soon as the period in winter quarters was over, Caesar, contrary to his usual practice, set out for northern Italy, travelling as fast as he could in order to canvass in the free towns and colonies on behalf of Mark Antony, whose candidature for the priesthood he was supporting. He was glad to use his influence to help Antony, who was a great friend of his, and whom he had sent ahead already to start electioneering. And he was also most anxious to oppose the small but powerful faction which was trying to get Antony defeated in the election, in order to weaken Caesar's own position when he retired from his province. As it was, he was still on the way, and had not yet reached Italy, when he heard that Antony had been elected. However, he felt that he still had a good reason for visiting the free towns and colonies. He wanted in the first place to thank them for coming out in such large numbers to vote for Antony, and at the same time he wished to ask them to support him when he stood for the consulship in the following year. For Caesar's enemies, using the most insolent language, were now boasting that the new consuls, Lucius Lentulus and Gaius Marcellus, had been elected simply in order to deprive him of office and of honour, and that Servius Galba, in spite of having been more popular and with a greater following among the voters, had nevertheless been kept out of the consulship because he was one of Caesar's friends and had been a general on his staff. Caesar's arrival in these free towns and colonies was greeted with extraordinary demonstrations, showing how much he was honoured and loved, for this was his first appearance there since his great victory against the whole of Gaul. Wherever Caesar was going to pass, the people did everything that could possibly be thought of in the way of decorating the gates, the streets, and all public places. The whole population of a place, all bringing their children with them, would come out to greet him. There were sacrifices everywhere. In the temples and marketplaces, the statues of the gods reclined on couches in the Thanksgiving ceremonial. Everything seemed to foreshadow the joy of the triumph for which he had had to wait so long. The rich spent their money on a grand scale to do him honour, and the poor did all they could in their enthusiasm to acclaim him. After rapidly going through the whole of Cisalpine Gaul, Caesar, again travelling very fast, returned to the army at Nemetocena. He ordered all the legions to leave their winter camps and proceed to the country of the Treveri, and, going there himself, he held a ceremonial review. He put Titus Labienus in charge of Cisalpine Gaul, hoping in this way to secure still greater support for himself when he stood for the consulship. He then undertook a series of easy marches, so as to be on the move, and to keep the troops in good training. At this time he was often told that his enemies were trying to win Labienus over to their side, and he was also informed of how a small group was trying to get a motion passed in the Senate, which would deprive him of part of his army. However, He refused to believe the stories about Labienus, and would do nothing to prevent a move against him in the Senate. In this view, he had nothing to fear from the Senate so long as the senators were allowed to vote freely. One of the tribunes, Gaius Curio, had undertaken to speak for him in the Senate and defend his interests, and Curio had several times given the following promise. If, he said, anyone was really alarmed at the prospect of Caesar taking up arms, as people in the city were certainly alarmed by the military tyranny of Pompey, then he would propose that both Caesar and Pompey should resign their commands and disband their troops. In this way, he pointed out, the state would be free and independent. These words of Curio were perfectly sincere, and he even tried to get the Senate to vote on his proposal. But the consuls and Pompey's friends opposed it, and by delaying tactics succeeded in preventing a division. This attitude of the Senate as a whole was important and in keeping with its behavior previously. The year before, Marcellus, in the course of an attack on Caesar's whole position, had brought forward a motion with regard to Caesar's province. This motion was premature and contravened the law passed by Pompey and Crassus. There was a debate, at the end of which Marcellus, whose one idea of becoming distinguished was to attack Caesar, called for a division. The Senate then unanimously rejected his proposals. However, Caesar's enemies were not discouraged by these setbacks, which merely prompted them to find still more powerful arguments to compel the Senate to approve measures which they had decided upon themselves. Then a decree of the Senate was passed which ordered both Pompey and Caesar to send 1 legion each for service in the Parthian War. Quite obviously, the effect of this decree was that both legions should be taken from Caesar, for Pompey had originally recruited the 1st Legion in Caesar's province, and had then sent it to Caesar. He now offered it for the Parthian War, as though it were his own. Caesar, however, though there could be no doubt about the aims of his enemies, sent back the 1st Legion to Pompey, and, in accordance with the decree of the Senate, ordered on his own account the 15th, which had been on duty in Cisalpine Gaul, to be handed over for service in Parthia. In its place, he sent the 13th Legion to Italy to undertake the garrison duties from which the 15th had been withdrawn. He personally made arrangements for the winter camps. Gaius Trebonius, with 3 legions, was stationed in Belgium. The same number, under Gaius Fabius, were sent into the country of the Aedui. In this way, he thought that Gaul would be most secure, with Roman armies posted among the Belgi, who are the most warlike people, and among the Aedui, who are the most influential. Caesar himself then set out for Italy. When he arrived there, he heard that, owing to the action of the consul Gaius Marcellus, the 2 legions which he had sent back, and which, according to the decree of the Senate, should have gone to serve in the Parthian War, had been handed over to Pompey, and were being kept in Italy. After this, there could be no doubt whatever about the plot that was being made against him. Yet, Caesar decided that he would submit to anything so long as there was any hope at all of being able to reach a constitutional settlement without having recourse to arms. He wrote a letter to the Senate, demanding that Pompey should lay down his command, and offering to do the same himself.